Elizabeth's been champing at the bit.
Well, just because I certainly didn't want anyone on Twitter misunderstanding that I suggested for one moment that Greens should associate themselves with the World Trade Organization. And my view is much closer to Tano's on this. I've seen what had been in the 40s and 50s a quite well-intentioned effort to not hurt the economies of smaller nations through industrialized world protectionism. The opening up of borders was seen in those days. I mean, let's face it, whatever you want to call it, the right wing of any generation is very good at appropriating the language that sounds nice. So liberal sounded nice, protection sounded nice, but then you get neoliberalism and protectionism.
I'm going to take another couple of these Twitter questions. This, I think, is, Elizabeth, a question possibly for you. Okay. What are the panelists' opinions on a multilateral investment court? Does that solve the problem?
No, it doesn't. That's the short answer I could take. The notion of an investment court, for those of you who don't follow this stuff closely, it's only in CETA. There's the notion, Cecilia Malmström, the EU trade negotiator commissioner, came up with this idea, well, if these secretive, horrible tribunals of arbitrators like Chapter 11 of NAFTA, oh, and by the way, the stupidest agreement Canada has ever entered into, which I should probably say is the stupidest agreement any nation on earth has ever entered into, except for the People's Republic of China, which won this one, is we have an investor-state agreement with the People's Republic of China with no trade benefits, no liberalization of access to markets, just a straight-up secret tribunal, so any state-owned enterprise of the People's Republic of China can bring secret charges against Canada anytime, and we're bound to it till the year 2045. So, but back to the question. In the face of these secretive trade agreements, secretive investor-state disputes, in an effort to get CETA through an unwilling European Union, this notion of an investor court came up, as though this would solve the problem because it would be more like a real court and less like what it's been, a secretive group of arbitrators meeting in a hotel room somewhere and taking away democratically arrived decisions. The problems and their flaws, I mean, it's clearly better, relatively speaking, that taking away our rights not be done in secret. But the investment court as proposed in CETA does not give citizens rights of access to present themselves as litigators in the sense of a court. It doesn't create an opportunity for those who worked to get a toxic chemical banned to bring in the leading scientist to explain why the toxic chemical had to be banned. It doesn't create a structure where the arbitrators are actually like judges and blocked from representing in other tribunals, like they're allowed, within the EU, they're only allowed to be judges in arbitration procedures and not within the EU represent as an advocate on one side or the other. But nothing precludes these folks from being what I called earlier, the global ambulance chasers. A kind of criminal class of $1,000 an hour lawyers is the fastest way to explain this setup. So they can go do that other kind of work and still sit as arbitrators in the investment court. It does not solve the problem.
Reinhard?
On CETA and the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism and the ICJ that is proposed under CETA, I completely agree with Elizabeth. That's not an option.
Our experience with the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement was we didn't know what the hell was in it. So the first point has to be that it's an open, democratic, transparent process so that legislators and indeed the community know what they're getting into. That should be point number one. So, you know, at the moment...
Just to push back on that, you know, the answer to that is always, well, we need to have the ability to negotiate. We can't give away our hand because then we'll get a bad trade agreement. How would you counter that?
My answer to that is if you don't want to tell the people what's in it, well, don't bother coming to us as legislators and asking us to support it. You know, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. So, I mean, the TPP was 6,000 pages, and we were asked to, as legislators in the Australian Senate, we were being told, you need to tell us whether you're going to support this or not without ever having seen it. Well, that's not free trade. That is profoundly undemocratic. And while we talk a lot about budget deficits. One of the biggest problems we've got in liberal democracies around the world is a democratic deficit, where we're seeing people being separated from the democracies that are supposed to represent them. We're seeing huge corporate interest through campaign finance, donations, etc., dominate political agendas, and they're doing it through trade agreements as well. And I mean, we just heard from Elizabeth about the role of ISDS provisions, which are effectively there to do the bidding of big corporations. I mean, at their heart, what they say is, we are removing the power from you as democratically elected legislators to make decisions. We are going to locate that decision within a tribunal, handpicked, who make a decision somewhere in secret on the validity of a claim of a corporation. That is not a democracy, right? That's a plutocracy. So you want to know what a green free trade policy looks like. First and foremost, open, transparent, democratic decision-making, and a process for resolving disputes that's also open and democratic. That's principle number one. The second, I think, principle has to be we're negotiating up in terms of protections, not down. Environmental protections, labour protections, public health protections, animal welfare protections. Trade, I mean, trade's a bit like technology. It's neutral. Trade can be a force for good, it can be, a force for disruption and negativity. So if we're going to embark on trade agreements, let's make sure that as a principle, we're negotiating up on all of those key standards. If we can achieve those things, if we can achieve an open and democratic process, and one that achieves an improvement in all of those standards, and one that delivers for people and not for corporations, then of course it's something we'll entertain. But until we have that framework in place, then you're going to continue to see the opposition to these trade agreements that you're seeing at the moment.
Thanks. I completely. I think one of the first things to say, which will always surprise the public, is to say a free trade agreement should be about trade and goods. Well, people think that's what they're all about, but they're not. They're about trade and services. They're about deregulating. They're about changing the location of power and control from a democratically elected government to a private tribunal that operates as if it was a private dispute between contracting parties in a business context. That's the context in which a foreign corporation brings an investor-state dispute against a government. It's fundamentally corrosive to democracy to imagine that a foreign corporation has superior powers to a domestic corporation to complain of a government action that was not taken with any animus to interrupt trade. So if we look at this and say, look, where does this populist outrage come from? What's the authentic, honest place for that anger? And there is a place for that anger. It comes from a neoliberal agenda that included deregulation as a central tenet, liberalization of trade as a central tenet, that, as you say, promised and underdelivered. It promised, boy, I can tell you, Canadians, when NAFTA came along, thought we were going to have a really wonderful open border. We could cross into the U.S., we could do all kinds. So watch what's happened with trade liberalization. Goods can flow, services can be privatized, taken away from local control, but people can't move much at all. So things are pretty, it's pretty perverse. And I think when you say, look, a trade deal shouldn't it be about, you shouldn't be able to stop a smaller country with a small economy from being able to sell their products fairly into our economy. People would say, that sounds fair. But if you tell them we should be able to say that our Canadian mining company has a right to sue some smaller African country if they pass a law that says that the rapacious activities of Canadian mining companies violating human rights should be stopped. Those are not trade agreements. Those are corporate rule agreements.
So a fair trade agreement is one that's limited to goods. Yeah. Reinhard?
I would add 2 points. One is a green trade agreement, I would think, should also contribute to fostering the transition, the green transition of our economies. a guiding principle could be the Sustainable Development Goals. So we could measure trade agreements against how would they contribute to sustainable development.
If we're adding in extra goals that, goals that deliver a higher humanitarian good or environmental good, then are we not getting into the territory of making them too complicated again?
I think that has been done in the past in the context of reducing agricultural subsidies in the international trade sphere. So why couldn't we do it with CO2 subsidies? I don't think it's easy. I'm not saying it's easy, but I think that's one of the challenges that we have.
Just to clarify, I didn't mean to say that trade shouldn't be complicated, but what we've done is the modern suite of trade agreements have imposed on governments such things as thou shalt operate under U.S. intellectual property rules. That's an intrusive and invasive decision that was made through negotiations in the interests of corporate rule. It has nothing to do with trade and goods. Trade and goods can quite properly say, as Reinhard said, you can't subsidize something that's so damaging to the biosphere that in another context, multilaterally, we've all agreed to phase out fossil fuels. So our trade rules should be consistent with the applications that of multilateralism. Sorry, I didn't mean to jump in again.
Caroline?
I do agree with most of what's been said so far, but because there's so much agreement between us, I think it's time to be a bit controversial. So, at the very beginning, Reinhard, I think you said, protectionism has never been a progressive force. And I agree with you until now, protectionism has had a very bad name, because basically in the 1930s, it was about protecting your own economy and then aggressively exploiting the economies of others. But also, actually, just now, Reinhard talked a lot about protecting jobs and maybe protecting standards and so forth. And so I want to make a case for reclaiming a bit of protection. But what I mean by that is Reinhard was just talking also about the economic dumping when it comes to the steel sector. But I think we should also be mindful of social and environmental dumping as well. And so if we want countries to be able to go ahead with higher environmental standards, higher animal welfare standards, then it seems to me to be fair to think about some way of being able to protect, for example, farmers in the UK who are meeting higher animal welfare standards than their competitors. I think we should think of a way of protecting them from unfair competition from people who do not maintain those same standards.
If we take seriously what everybody here has said, that we are all free and equal citizens of the globe, then the best things that are produced elsewhere, best in all the senses, best of the word that we can think of, ought to be available to everybody else. If there's a good textbook or a good computer that's been produced, it ought to be available to those who are not yet in a position to do that for themselves, and it mightn't always be wise that they ought to replicate that process all over again anyway. What is important, though, is the relationship between people, human beings. That is the critical thing. It's not a matter of goods. The conditions under which the goods are produced is a relationship between human beings. The conditions under which they're exchanged is also a relationship between human beings.
The threat of creating a world of international economic relations where the ultimate sovereignty does not lie with multilateral institutions, does not lie with nation states, does not lie with local communities, but with the corporations. That's the dystopian vision that some people pursue, and to oppose that, that's what we have to do.
The worst case scenario. Okay.
Yeah, I should say, I agreed. I just think that the more we talk about trade in isolation from the underlying inequalities, the perverse and quite exploitative relationships that have arisen. You trade in a vacuum can't really be examined without looking at structural adjustment, without looking at the requirements placed on debtor nations in the developing world, and these now are sometime in the past, but they have had their effect of telling a nation, you don't look like a worthy debtor because you're growing food for your local people, and you'll do much better with a cash economy if you could grow flowers for Europe. You'll look much better to to us, the World Bank or the IMF, if you're growing something that you can export for cash. So there's been decades now of post-colonialism. So we've lost the empires of the crown, and we have the empires of the almighty dollar and the Cargills and the Monsantos and the Coca-Colas, and they've redesigned the world in a way that advantages their shareholders. So when we now talk about trade, we don't start tabula rasa. If we're starting with where Richard is, which I completely agree, fair trade is about free and open and democratic and transparent, and that has to start with non-coercive. So if the place in which nations around the world find themselves has already been coerced to the place where they are not enabled to make their priority in domestic politics self-sufficiency in food security, then you can hardly say any deal for trade is fair.
So in our remaining time, I want to take our 2 questions from the floor. You've all been waiting patiently. Thank you for that.